one of the things that I love about the Christian calendar is that it really helps us to pay attention to themes that we might neglect, and pay attention to themes that Protestant evangelicals, I believe, have a tendency to neglect. And a really good example of this is the Ascension of Christ. You know, we read about the Ascension in Acts chapter 1. We also read about it in a variety of places in the epistles, and typically in the sermons in the book of Acts. You know, the Ascension is always in the sermons. For instance, in the sermon of Stephen before he's stoned, it's always one of the sort of primary themes that is preached by the early apostles when they are trying to sort of make sense of what it is that Jesus has done. And so we might ask, what is the Ascension? What does it mean, and why should we pay attention to it? Well, the Ascension means a great many things, and I can only talk about a few of those things today. But one of the things it means is that heaven and earth in the ministry of Jesus Christ are really sort of reunited with each other. That's ultimately what this Ascension celebration is all about. Now, in order to understand the significance of that, we really sort of need to hold in check our preconceptions about the relationship between heaven and earth. We tend in the West to think in highly sort of dualistic terms, which have been borrowed more from, I wouldn't even say Greek philosophy. I think it's just easy to think this way. We kind of imagine that that earth and all that we see in this sort of physical or material realm is all that there is. If we are Christians and we believe in heaven, then we believe that heaven is a kind of different geographical region, but up in the sky somewhere. And so there's this sort of geographical space between heaven and earth. But that is actually certainly not the biblical view. They believed that heaven and earth were sort of two different dimensions. Earth is the place, of course, where humans dwell. But then we have the heavenly dimension, which is kind of the invisible realm of God. And of the angels and of the powers and principalities which are here with us even though we do not see them. And the story of the Bible is a story of human rebellion against the God who rules over both heaven and earth. And so it's a story about human beings sort of turning away from this heavenly realm and pretending as though God were not there, as though his sovereignty were not true, and trying to live on our own. And so in many ways, the Bible is a story of God reuniting heaven and earth so that creatures on earth might be more aware of and more obedient to the heavenly realm. And now we see this actually taking place all throughout the biblical story. For instance, in Genesis 1 and 2, of course, we have the creation of the world, and we have God in Genesis 2 coming to inhabit this world. You know, he dwells in the garden with Adam and Eve, and they're aware of his presence. However, they rebel against him, claiming to no longer need to obey his law. And what happens? Well, they're cast out of the garden and out of the presence of God, as though they have turned their backs on him. Well, as the story of redemption sort of progresses throughout the Old Testament, what we see is God ultimately trying to take back the earthly realm to sort of make his presence known once again, or at least wake up humans to his presence so that they might be attentive to it, they might worship rightly, obey rightly, etc., etc. And so this is most obviously going on as God instructs Moses and the people of Israel to build the tabernacle, which is going to be the place where God dwells on earth with his people, as a kind of reconstitution of Eden where God had once dwelled. And of course, as the Israelites journey with the tabernacle toward the promised land, God's presence goes with them. This is kind of like a beachhead that has been taken by God. As they enter into the promised land and are instructed ultimately to build the temple, it's as though God is sort of setting up his Eden on earth as a more permanent kind of beachhead, but always with the objective of ultimately taking it all back and making the earth once again his own. In other words, in sort of reuniting heaven and earth once again. And so when we come to the birth of Jesus Christ, the incarnation, we have a really important and very particular sort of battle won. God enters into this creation in material form so that God's presence in a much more intimate way is dwelling with his people on earth. Of course, Jesus lives his life and ministry and becomes a new law. He becomes a revelation of the will of God and of the character of God and of the nature of God to his own disciples and to all the people of Israel, whether they receive him or not. Well, when he goes to the cross and he is crucified, there's a really important thing that happens. And that is, at the time of his death, the curtain of the temple, it is said in Matthew chapter 27, is torn in two. And when that happens, it suggests that the barrier standing between the presence of God and all of his creation is torn apart so that the throne room of God is sort of exposed to the world. This is a kind of premonition of what is going to happen with the resurrection and the ascension and then with Pentecost. And that is, Jesus is, of course, raised from the dead, which is a sign of God's triumph over sin and evil. It's a way of telling the human beings that God will not allow them to kill themselves, to commit a kind of collective suicide. He, in fact, in the person of Jesus Christ, absorbs all of their sin and evil and death into himself. And when he's raised from the dead, it's a great victory for all of humankind. But then, when he ascends into heaven, and we read about this again in Acts chapter 1, and we'll look at it this coming Sunday, it's as though God himself, in human form, is lifting humanity up into heaven and reuniting heaven and earth in a permanent kind of way. Because whenever Jesus ascends into heaven and takes his rightful place at the right hand of God, and when he begins to rule from heaven over earth as the ascended Lord, then humanity itself is with God for all eternity because Jesus takes his humanity with him. Now, this occurs, of course, just before the Pentecost, when suddenly, from the throne of God, the Holy Spirit descends upon the earth to make, again, God's presence available on earth, but spread out over all the peoples and nations. So it's as though what was sort of predicted with the tearing of the curtain of the temple actually occurs at Pentecost. That is, God, in all his glory and with all of his authority, comes upon the church and is spread out to all the nations of the world. And of course, we'll talk about Pentecost on another occasion. But what this suggests is that the church really sort of receives power to complete its mission at Pentecost, but because of the ascension. And that mission, of course, is to continue this work of reuniting heaven and earth, of making all the earth a realm wherein God's authority is made manifest. And so the church now lives in what we'd call a kind of time between the time, where we rule with Jesus Christ in a kind of hidden way in anticipation of his second coming, or of his coming in fullness at the end of the age, when in fact every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And at that time, God's mission throughout all of biblical history will be complete, because these two realms of heaven and earth will be brought back together. And the ascension is a key part of that process.